secessionist territory, and the interior being largely ignored, holds to the present day. Even contemporary China's political system reflects this. All of the critical military branches of government are headquartered in the north. The north and central regions trade off the premiership every decade in order to balance security and trade interests, while the south is not even represented on the Politburo. Such a geographic look at the country lays bare the greatest myth about China, that it is united. I'm not talking here about the concept of the mainland versus Taiwan, red China versus white China, but rather the idea that the mainland itself can ever truly be a unified entity. Taking a closer look at history indicates that China's past periods of unity are anything but. The Han and Tang dynasties are often held up as the exemplars of Chinese unity, but the Han were typically split among regional power centers. At times, the Han bloodline held together while the actual territories it controlled shifted, while the Tang spent the first third of their era engaged in military activities to expand their empire and the last half in failed efforts to maintain it. The other two major unified periods, the Yuan and the Qing, were actually spearheaded by non-Han ethnicities that managed to achieve what the Han Chinese couldn't do for themselves, which was to conquer and hold all of China. Don't be too harsh on the Chinese. The Yuan were the Mongols. Not a lot slowed them down. So that's the problem. China does not naturally hold together, even within its core regions. Its different regions want different things, and access the world on different terms, if they want to access the world at all. Making matters worse, the outside world accesses different parts of China in different ways. Guangdong and southern China are often de facto colonies. Shanghai and central China are accessed as peers. Northern China tends to be avoided, unless it is being occupied. And just as maritime powers can choose the time and place of their invasions and interactions, the Chinese have almost never been able to defend themselves from ship-based outsiders. The outsider who has always mattered the most was very close to home. Japan, China's boogeyman. The Japanese islands are incredibly mountainous. 90% of the population lives in a series of small coastal enclaves. As soon as an enterprising Japanese figured out how to float a boat large enough to transport a few soldiers, the Japanese people unified in terms of culture, identity, and even government, very early compared to most of the world's other peoples. The island's ruggedness also meant that Japan's maritime nature became infused into Japanese culture. Boats of all sizes played the part of roads and tunnels right up until the 3rd century of the industrial era. This mix of factors makes Japan a strategic extrovert. If your country has loads of ships as part of its basic operation, it is very easy for you to reach out and touch others. Due to proximity, Japan touched the Koreans the most, exploiting Korean resources and labor and ultimately generating a visceral enmity between the two cultures that will long outlast the present day. China was the next most touched, and understanding the Japanese impact upon China requires a bit of a diversion into the geopolitics of Japan. By the time deep-water navigation technologies reached the Orient in the 18th century, the Japanese had already been pirates without peer for over 200 years. While the East Asian coast was far harsher than the Mediterranean, there are strings of islands that roughly parallel the coastline from the southern tip of Japan all the way to contemporary Indonesia. Getting lost was hard to do. As with most naval powers, over time raiding turned into brokering and the Japanese became the trading middlemen across the East Asian rim. But when the industrial age reached Japan in the 1800s, the Japanese discovered that they brought almost nothing to the table. The home islands possessed next to nothing in terms of material resources, at best a mediocre market, and one segmented by their island's rugged topography at that. So the Japanese used the one tool they did have, their navy, and took what they needed from their Asian neighbors, whether resources or markets. In the case of China, they took both. A lot of both. The degree of Japanese action on the Chinese mainland ebbed and flowed over time, but Japanese expansionism typically marched to the drum of Japanese internal politics rather than Chinese resistance. By the early 20th century, the Japanese had repeatedly pressed home to the Chinese and the Koreans and the Russians just how potent a competent naval power could be. Japan conquered Korea outright in 1905, and in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-5, sank the entirety of Russia's Pacific and Baltic fleets in just 2 battles. In a strategic sense, it was a purely one-way relationship. Throughout the long reach of Chinese history, Chinese culture may have wielded rich influence throughout East Asia and even in Japan, but it was almost unheard of for the land-bound Chinese to exercise physical control over their own borderlands, much less the maritime zones that dominated the entirety of the Chinese offshore, much less the wider world. If the concept of a unified China, much less a globally significant China, is an aberration, then something drastic must have happened to overcome the many traps of the Chinese geography. Well, it comes back to those damned Americans. They did 3 things that not only preserved China, but made the contemporary colossus we currently know as modern China possible. First, it was the Americans who removed Japan as a threat. Japan and China had been locked in a bilateral war for nearly 5 years before the Americans joined World War II. Historians and theorists can of course debate how the Japanese-Chinese War would have ended if not for its folding into World War II. But the simple fact remains that at the time of Pearl Harbor, the Chinese had already lost the conventional war and were pouring all of their efforts into guerrilla tactics. Even when the Japanese started fighting and losing to the Americans in the Southeast Asian and Pacific theaters, they were still making steady progress across China, where their foes represented a not yet industrialized civilization. And as the Japanese vividly demonstrated in the execution of some 250,000 Chinese in Nanking, they would not be leaving without exacting a heavy toll. By the time the mushroom clouds rose over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Japanese had, for years, held every part of Chinese territory that made China economically and politically viable, including the entirety of the North China Plain, all of the lower Yangtze including Shanghai, and all of the major southern port cities across Fujian and Guangdong, including Jaipu, Xiamen, Fuzhou, Shantou, and Hong Kong. If it was worth taking, the Japanese took it. Independent China was left with the interior scraps, and China only regained its sovereignty because Japan's surrender to the Americans in 1945 stipulated the recall of all Japanese forces from all theaters. Japan's subsequent folding into the growing Bretton Woods network in 1955 ended Japan's imperial interest in China. Under the Bretton Woods system, the Japanese had full access to resources and markets on a global scale, far more than the relatively piddling Chinese resources and markets that Japan had waged war to secure only 2 decades previously. In a stroke, the Americans had not so much ended Japanese imperialism as removed any rationale Japan might have had to be imperialist in the first place. And East Asia without Japanese aggression was one in which China could potentially unify. In the 5 years after World War II, China finally finished its civil war, an internal conflict that was fought alongside the Sino-Japanese War and World War II, and became truly unified. Second, World War II's conclusion radically changed the region's naval balance of power. By war's end, the Americans had wiped the Pacific clean of Japanese forces, but that was only one piece of the puzzle. The European navies were also gone, in part due to the Japanese themselves, but mostly due to American actions in Europe. While Japan was certainly the country guiltiest of suppressing the Chinese, they were far from the only one. In the century leading up to World War II, all of the Europeans had carved out pieces of the globe for their respective empires, and China was hardly exempt. Most European countries cut economic and military deals with individual Chinese cities, some willingly, some at the end of a gun, in order to access Chinese labor and markets, often integrating them into imperial supply chains. In the most infamous cases, the Europeans forced addictive narcotics onto the Chinese populations, generating robust market demand and security dependency at the same time. With good reason, the Chinese look back on the Opium Wars of the Spheres of Influence period as one of the darkest moments of their history. What is often overlooked is what made China such an easy target for the Europeans and Japanese and Americans: deepwater navigation and industrialization. Without their long-reach navies and advanced military technologies, the Europeans would have never been able to reach China in the first place, much less subjugate it more or less at their whim. At the end of World War II, the European navies were simply gone, so any thought that the spheres of influence period could continue evaporated. Moreover, the Americans' imposition of Bretton Woods upon Europe meant that the Europeans no longer had an interest in even trying. For the first time in 4 centuries, with the notable exception of the British in Hong Kong and the Portuguese in Macau, there was no European footprint in China. The American defeat of Japan may have ended the war on the mainland, but it was the American presence in Europe that actually gave China its economy.